Water resistance for wristwatches is far more important than water resistance for pocket watches or clocks. Historically, water resistance was not really an issue for a watchmaker. It wasn't until the past 80 years, even fewer than that, maybe 70, that anyone started thinking about water resistance for a timing device. Today, with modern watches, water resistance is extremely important. It's one feature that people compare watches against one another. Here in Nashville, Tennessee, we have quite a bit of humidity. And even humidity comes into play when you're dealing with a wristwatch. Having a water-resistant wristwatch is important. So I say water resistance. And the reason I say water resistance is because we don't make waterproof watches. A waterproof watch does not exist. They may have been marketed as waterproof in the past, but current standards don't allow for a watch to be marketed as waterproof. And the reason is because as an industry, we have decided that waterproof would actually mean that the watch movement itself is not affected by water. And that's not a true statement. Every watch movement, if water gets into it, into the watch case and onto the movement parts, it will be damaged. So unless you can make a watch that would allow for water to get inside and still work perfectly fine, you cannot call it waterproof. So the consensus is that if it can be damaged by water, it cannot be labeled waterproof. So in watchmaking, we use the term water resistant because the case is designed to protect the movement. How water resistant? That comes down to the design of the case, the type of gaskets used, and really it starts from the intended use of that product. At the very beginning, before the case is designed, before the size is determined, the thickness of the crystals, the type of gaskets, even the features. Adding more features and buttons and things like that to the outside of the watch case will make it harder and more complex to reach a higher water resistance rating because you're adding holes where you have to add seals and you're adding moving parts. In a watch, you'll typically find a couple of different materials that are used for sealing the parts as they go together. Those materials are Teflon for crystal gaskets, or it could be Hytrel, which is another very similar material to Teflon. And then you also have rubber O-rings. So for the rubber O-rings, they could be any different type of rubber, but one rubber that is very good for a wristwatch O-ring is Viton. And this is a particular type of rubber that is a patented, trademarked material, but it has a hardness that is just right for deforming at the size that we want it on a wristwatch. It will also last a very long time, and it's resistant to many different chemicals. Now, we don't have a lot of extremely harsh chemicals contacting our watches, but we do have some things that will affect water resistance, like colognes and perfumes, lotions, chlorine from going in pools, salt from the ocean. There are many different oils and weaker chemicals that will get onto those seals and slowly try to break them down over time. And that brings me to another point. Water resistance is not permanent. When a watch is made, it is tested for water resistance. That does not mean that once it's water resistant, it will always be water resistant. You could get a brand new watch that is water resistant, wear it one day, expose it to a certain type of chemical, damage a seal, and now it's no longer water resistant. Or it could be dropped, and the case could bend so that a round hole is slightly oval, and pressure on one side of an O-ring is greater than pressure on another side. The watch might no longer be water resistant to the specified depth rating or pressure rating at that point. So it's very important to remember that water resistance is not permanent, and it needs to be checked regularly if you plan to rely on the fact that a watch is water resistant. If you look at vintage watches, many vintage watches were not designed to be water resistant in the first place. There are some vintage dive watches, for instance, that were designed to be water resistant when they were made. But they might not be able to be water resistant today. An example of that is a Rolex Submariner. Some of the first Rolex Submariners use a plastic crystal as the sealing surface. So the plastic crystal is actually shaped like a dome, and it fits over a metal ring on the case. And then another metal ring is pressed over it to compress the crystal. So the plastic crystal is actually what is sealing that case. As the plastic ages, it will get microfractures in it, along that edge specifically. And now that crystal will no longer seal on that case. So unless you replace the crystal, it won't be possible to make that watch water resistant again. Also, another thing with vintage watches, like a vintage dive watch, would be if salt water accessed an area on the outside of an O-ring, it could make its way into that crevice and stay there for a very long time. And if a watch is from the 60s and it got salt water in there, and it sat there and was not rinsed or cleaned for the past 60 years, then there very well might be some pitting. And that pitting in the case could actually lead to an O-ring not ever being able to seal that watch again. This is one of the reasons that more frequent maintenance is required on a watch when it's used in situations like diving or swimming, or even just a watch that's worn regularly. Sweat is also corrosive to a watch. So even if you've never been in the water with that watch, it's very likely that there is a mixture of body oils and sweat that have worked their way into the outside part of the gasket and are sitting on the stainless steel edges of the O-ring groove, and they will start to corrode and pit that stainless steel. If you don't service that watch every 5 years, and you maybe go 10 or 20 years without servicing it, well, that area will never get cleaned, and it will continue to corrode, and it might get to the point where it can't be kept. And at that point, you would have to replace the case or the case back, whichever is too corroded, in order to get the water resistance back. And when dealing with a vintage watch, that's something you don't really want to do. Replacing the case would take away almost all the value. So if you use your watch in water, even if it's a pool, there's going to be chlorine or pool salts that will get into those cracks and crevices in the watch case. They won't reach the movement, but they will reach the outside of the O-ring, and they could sit there and start to cause corrosion. So by bringing your watch to a watchmaker or sending it to a service facility, they'll be able to take it apart and reach all those little areas that you can't even see where there might be salt or corrosive chemicals kind of hiding. They'll be able to clean that away during the service. So it is important, even if a watch isn't having timing issues, to do regular service, especially if you wear it regularly. It really will extend the life of your watch by keeping the case components in good condition and keeping it water resistant.